Greetings, beautiful people. Take one. So I decided to make this short video based on some comments that you guys shared, and I'm going to give just a little bit of information from chapter one. And mainly, I'm focusing on information presented in Psychology in Everyday Life, fifth edition for David G. Myers and C. Nathan DeWall. And in that chapter one, they talk about like what is psychology. The title is technically Psychology's Roots, Critical Thinking, and Self-Improvement Tools. So in chapter one, you can learn all about the history of psychology as well as the modern perspectives. And there's one, two, three, four, five sections. The first section is psychology is a science. The second is the need for psychological science. And then how do psychologists ask and answer questions, as well as psychology's research ethics, and use psychology to become a stronger person and a better student. Now, to go over the entire chapter, it would take more than the time that I want to spend making this video, and I think I would lose your attention. So I'm going to just key in on one thing, or really not one thing, one section for this short video, and then I'll move into doing some other videos with more content on some of the other sections in the textbook. So this is coming from a table that's presented to you, and the table is 1.1 Psychology's Current Perspectives. Now, the reason why I want to talk about psychology's current perspectives is because this is something that sometimes is overlooked or glossed over, but really, if you can understand the perspectives in psychology, the modern approaches, this is an excellent foundation for the duration of the class, okay? Because essentially, each perspective is given its own attention in an entire chapter throughout the textbook. So, for example, there's a perspective titled Behavioral Approach. When we talk about learning theory, guess what? That's all about the behavioral approach. There's a perspective titled Cognitive. And when we talk about memory, thinking, language, and intelligence, that's the cognitive perspective. There's a perspective titled Neuroscience. And wouldn't you know it, this week, in week 2, we're studying the biological foundations of behavior, which is basically biopsychology, aka behavioral neuroscience. So I'm going to talk about these current perspectives, and there's 7 presented in our textbook. I'll go over them, give you an example, and then we'll call it a day. Now, what I want from you is a thumbs up. I also want questions. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, go ahead and leave me a question, and I will reply either by responding to your question or I will make another video. So these perspectives, think of it like this. When psychology first came on the scene, so as you know, psychology emerged from 2 older, more established disciplines. You basically had the natural sciences, so we're talking chemistry, biology, right? The natural sciences, and then you had philosophy and art. And basically, the 2 of those older, more established disciplines came together and birthed psychology. So psychology is really a discipline that studies human behavior and mental processes using the scientific method. But if you look at the history of psychology, it came from, the natural sciences and art and philosophy. So the early psychologists were philosophers, or they were mathematicians, or they were biologists or medical doctors, right? So when you think about it that way, this lays a good foundation for these modern approaches or modern perspectives. What I want you to do is, when we're talking about perspectives, to perceive something is to see it. So these modern perspectives are different ways of seeing human behavior and mental processes. So depending on the perspective that you take, this is how you are analyzing or attempting to understand what makes people do what they do and think what they think. All right. So the very first perspective that we generally talk about in my general psychology classes is the psychodynamic approach. And the reason why is because Sigmund Freud is a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, who basically put psychology on the map. So you might have heard some stuff about Freud, smoked a cigar, the stuff about him being very attached to his mother. But Freud believed that the unconscious is very important. And this means that when you make a decision to wear a cute little jacket, you didn't think about, the implications of wearing this jacket or why you decided to wear it. You just put it on. But unconscious, in the back of your mind, there was something that drove you to make this decision. And Freud talks about conflict that goes on in your head, in your psyche, that is guiding your behavior. Okay, so when you think about the psychodynamic approach, think about unconscious motivation and unconscious conflict as guiding your behavior. So the reason why you do what you do, you're not aware of it. All right, that's the first perspective we're going to mention. The next perspective we're going to mention is the behavioral approach. And the behavioral approach is drastically different than the psychodynamic approach. So with Freud and the neo-Freudians, people who came after Freud but agreed with Freud, those people thought that the unconscious and the mind is what psychology should study. Well, the behaviorists, which include people like B.F. Skinner, John B. Watson, uh, um, Marion Breland Bailey, Rosalie Rayner, these people, they believe that if you want to study people, you want to understand people, you should focus on what they do, on their actions. All right. So they didn't care about any unconscious conflict. The behaviorists were like, no, what do you do? So whatever you do and how you're rewarded for what you do, that's going to determine whether you're likely to engage in this behavior again in the future or abandon it. Okay. So the behaviorists said, if you want to understand people, look at what they do. Look at how they've been rewarded or punished over the course of their life. All right. Which is different than the psychodynamic approach that said there's unconscious conflict going on in their mind. Okay. So those are the first two perspectives. The third perspective we're going to mention would be the third force in psychology, which is the humanistic movement. But in our textbook, they don't really talk about the humanistic movement or the humanistic perspective. So we're going to skip over that and go to neuroscience. And for neuroscience, you can see in the word neuron and science, right? So the study of neurons, the study of the nervous system. So with the neuroscience approach, you're basically saying, hey, let me put on my glasses that allow me to look at the world through a biological lens. So neuroscience is associated with biological psychology. So whereas the psychodynamic approach looked at the unconscious conflicts and the behavioral approach looked at what you do and your actions to understand what you did, the neuroscience approach says, hey, it's all about the neurons. It's all about brain structures. It's all about biology. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, if someone had been diagnosed with a psychological disorder, if you were taking a neuroscience approach, a behavioral neuroscience approach, you're going to explain their behavior in terms of brain chemistry, right? So in terms of neurotransmitters, in terms of structures, you're looking for a biological explanation for why they engaged in that behavior. So if the person has a psychological disorder, you might be in favor of medication because you're saying, hey, if we can change their biology, we can change their actions. If you were a psychoanalytic psychologist or a psychodynamic, a person who believed in the psychodynamic approach, then you're going to say, hey, we should talk to them and find out what's in their unconscious. We need to uncover stuff that's hidden deep in their psyche, which is much different than prescribing medication, right? And then if you were a behavioral therapist or you took the behavioral approach, you're going to say, hey, you know what? It's all about giving them specific homework assignments, getting them to change their behaviors, change their actions, reward them or punish them, and then that's going to shape their behavior, and we can understand them that way by looking at what they do. So those are three perspectives: the behavioral approach, the psychodynamic approach, and the behavioral neuroscience or neuroscience approach. Those are three. The video is always at 9 minutes, so it's going pretty long. But I'm going to mention behavioral genetics and evolutionary. You might lump those with the neuroscience approach, and just all together that could be considered biological psych, so have an umbrella term. But with the evolutionary perspective, think about what you know about evolution, survival of the fittest, basically focusing on nature and the interaction between nature and nurture, so genes and upbringing, and you're adding in an element of ancestry. So what has worked for generations in the past over a long period of time. And that's how we're going to explain behavior and mental processes, by focusing on what's worked for our ancestors. Now, for behavioral genetics, Now, the question they have in or the statement they have in the textbook is how our genes and our environment influence our individual differences. So you can see how behavior genetics and neuroscience and evolutionary approach all kind of come together under a biological umbrella. All right. So the last two we need to mention, and hopefully we won't get too much further, would be the cognitive approach and the sociocultural approach. So with the cognitive approach, think about everything that goes on in your head, everything that's in your mind, okay? So cognitive psychologists say, hey, it's not necessarily just what the person does, it's what they're thinking. So the cognitive approach focuses on both unconscious and conscious thoughts. They study things like memory, attention, problem solving, everything that goes on in your mind, right? So that again is different than a behavioral approach, which focuses on what you do, your actions. So notice the difference between thinking, I think this, or I believe this, and actually doing something. Okay. So the last approach that your textbook mentions is the social-cultural approach. And you can see two words blended or meshed together, social and culture. So culture, think of it as kind of like the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. It's kind of like it's everywhere. It's related to religion. It's related to language. It's related to how a group of people pass on their values and their beliefs from one generation to the next. So culture is pervasive. Anthropologists study culture, and in social psych and sociologists also focus a lot on culture. But the social cultural approach says if you want to understand someone, you need to consider the groups that they belong to and the culture that they've been raised in and the culture that they exist in. So that's to say that if you really wanted to understand your instructor, Professor Sims, and you were looking at me and analyzing my actions and my thoughts from a social cultural approach, you're going to consider the fact that I'm a woman, and you're going to consider the fact that I am Black. And you're going to say that explains why she decided to wear her hair in dreadlocks, right? If you were a behavioral psychologist, you might say, well, how has she been rewarded for keeping her hair a certain length, right? Instead of being bald, for example. If you were a psychodynamic therapist or a theorist, you would ask the question about my unconscious motivation. What am I unaware of, right? So in each of these different perspectives, they're just different ways to explain what people think and what they do. All right. This is each way of trying to really get to the bottom of the question, who are we? All right. Now, throughout the entire semester, we'll be revisiting these perspectives. And like I said, I'll try a few different formats with the videos, but this is a good start in terms of reading and trying to understand these perspectives. Here's a task I would encourage you to do. Pick out something about yourself, all right? Like perhaps maybe why you decided to major in whatever you're deciding to major in. And then take that one thing and analyze it from at least 3 different perspectives. Try to come up with questions and a focus that a behavioral psychologist might focus on. What kind of questions or statements would a psychodynamic theorist say? And then what about a cognitive psychologist? All right. So I'm using the term theorist and therapist interchangeably, but they're very different. A therapist is someone who helps people, with mental illness usually, but I'm kind of using them interchangeably because in a general psych class, often people associate psychology with therapy, but psychology is so much bigger than just mental illness, right? You have people who study educational psychology, like myself. You have people who study industrial organizational psychology, who go to the business side. You have sports psychologists, right? You even have psychology within the field of advertising. So psychology is in a lot of different places. It's not just about therapy. These different perspectives often have theories which are attached to the perspectives. So if you want to be more precise, think of these as associated with theories rather than just therapies. Okay, we're at 14 minutes and 35 seconds, so I'm going to stop it there. If you have questions, comments, compliments, or concerns, go ahead and drop a comment for me or drop a question. And like I said, I will either make another video or I will address it via directly via the thread. That's all I got.